focusing on good governance or an efficient government, question arises, should there be a separation of the roles of an elected representative and a government minister? Well, to discuss this question, I am joined by political analyst and chairman for the Council for Responsible Political Behaviour, Dr. Bishnu Ragoonath. Good morning, Dr. Ragoonath.
Good morning.
Well, thank you for joining me, sir, this morning on the program. Let me start off with back to the topic, a separation of an elected representative and a government minister. Would this lead, if it were to happen, the pros of it happening, would it lead to greater accountability, transparency, and perhaps checks and balances?
Well, not necessarily. For everything you see, there are the pros and the cons. And yes, we can talk about, if you separate the MP from the minister, well, then the minister will have greater freedom. But of course, the question then begs is simply, and the minister will have more time to do his job. But the question then begs, where's the accountability? The MP is accountable to Parliament. Where is the minister going to be accountable? We have to put in place now other mechanisms that would then dictate as the ability to account and the capacity to account to the citizenry if you are to set up such a system.
But in that sense, even though there is an aspiration for greater accountability and transparency, if such a separation was to become reality and mechanisms were put in place, could that lead perhaps to more bureaucratic red tape or less bureaucratic red tape with more mechanisms?
Well, again, that would depend on the mechanisms that are put in place. I mean, we can't prejudge what mechanisms will be put in place. And in that regard, we just simply have to wait and see what mechanisms are put in place. Take, for instance, and I mean, you could step out of bounds here. Take, for instance, we passed procurement regulations, legislation. We got the regulations in place, but then the courts have told the government that that will create challenges for the court system if we go with those regulations as they were. And hence, we cannot implement procurement legislation. So the point about it here is simply, yes, we could put in legislation, we could do things, but we have to see how they work. And we cannot prejudge what mechanisms will go in there and what mechanisms will not go in there.
And understood. If we were to toy with some ideas, though, I mean, and these are conversations I've had off air, one of the ideas is how do we go about implementing such? Is it that a government minister is appointed by an elected prime minister or elected, or should they be elected by the voting public as well? Is that key if we are to see true separation, that both portfolios, be it an elected representative and a minister, should be elected by the voting public? Or should there be some hand by the Prime Minister to appoint who he desires in certain positions, as we see now?
Well, I mean, it is nonsensical in a way to have the voting public elect both members of Parliament as well as ministers. That is nonsensical. Mm-hmm. So that just simply cannot fly. And even if that flies, herein comes a big challenge. Who is that minister accountable to, the electorate or to the government, the prime minister and the government in office? And if he's accountable only to the electorate, well, then he doesn't have to do what the prime minister wants him to do. He doesn't have to follow governmental policy, and that's where it becomes ridiculous to make such a suggestion.
Governmental policy, a minister looks at more so national policy, but a representative might look more so at policy for the area. Could this affect the role of local government? I mean, even now we're questioning what is the role of local government if you have an elected representative. The public does not entirely understand those rules. Could there be clarification to this role of local government?
Well, clearly, local government has been an institution which we have used in Trinidad and Tobago since the 1950s. The unfortunate thing about local government is that when money became no problem in the 1970s, local government was emasculated. Mm-hmm. And having emasculated local government, people were told, well, look, local government is only seen about cleaning drain and cutting the grass in the playgrounds. But the point about it, local government, every action in local government, and I'm a proponent of local government, every action in local government relates to the development of the people. Challenge herein, however, is simply do local government representatives themselves understand that? Do citizens understand that? And is local government simply a whipping horse when government policy does not deliver? Then they say blame local government. But the point about it here is simply one which says that we need to restructure our local government system. Local government systems are vital if we are to have good government, good governance, and development. It is also a system that will allow for greater transparency and accountability. The unfortunate thing is simply that within our culture, local government has not been given that prestige, it has not been given that autonomy, and that is where the whole big issue comes in. Take, for instance, the Tobago House of Assembly. That is a local government institution. Now, Tobagonians hate me for saying that the THA is local government, but the point about it is simply that the THA is a subnational government, which is local government. And in that context, it works. It works for the people, and people look towards the THA. In Trinidad and Tobago, would anybody look first at the regional corporation or the municipal corporation and expect them to do what the THA is doing? No, they wouldn't. And that was simply because central government played a heavy hand in undermining the powers of local government. Now, question, can we get to that stage? Well, yes, we can. It's going to be a long, hard road. And in the same way you talk about separating ministers from MPs, it's a long, hard road. And that long, hard road means we need constitutional reform. In Trinidad and Tobago, with the stroke of a pen and a simple majority in the parliament, the government could have said, we no longer have local government. Do you know that? Mm-hmm. And as opposed to Tobago, when they need a special majority to eliminate or remove the THA, because THA has been entrenched in the constitution. Not so with local government in Trinidad. And this is why, for instance, the government could come and say, all right, fine, we're not going to have a local government elections this year. We're going to postpone it till next year, and we're going to postpone it till the year after, and we're going to postpone it. Mm-hmm. And we can do that on and on and on because there are no constitutional guarantees. And that's where we have to understand that we have to, where we have to understand where we want to take local government. But again, herein comes the challenge. In a small state like Trinidad and Tobago, in a small state, okay, not like Tobago more so, but like Trinidad, what happens? You have a central government who is fighting for a clientele and not giving local government that opportunity. So clientelism is the reason why central government has emasculated and continues to emasculate local government. Mm-hmm. We've heard the Prime Minister complain that local government cannot deliver. Well, why can local government not deliver? And simply because local government is dependent upon central government for funding and resources, which they are not getting. So we're not going to go very far.
Well, Dr. Ragoonath, if local government, due to a number of reasons, was emasculated, as described, and there's no constitutional guarantees. In fact, if central government is really the body that is charged with bringing about reform, could in a sense, could true reform actually happen if the current situation has been and is politically favorable to them?
I don't necessarily follow your question.
In the sense that, where could we get reform if currently the systems are actually designed by central government and have been left that way?
Well, basically, again, you ask where can we get reform, and again, the question then begs, how do we get reform? The Constitution allows the cabinet to make policy. Section 75(1) of the Constitution said there shall be a cabinet which shall be responsible for making policy and making policy with regard to Trinidad and Tobago. So if we have to now go back to the Constitution and let the Constitution, so you need constitutional reform, but you also need a forward-thinking government who is willing to now properly decentralize power away from central government into the hands of local government. That is the only way it could happen. That is what happened way back in 1980 when we had the Tobago House of Assembly. But of course, the Tobago House of Assembly at that point in time was simply a shifting of what was then the Tobago County Council into a Tobago House of Assembly, to say, giving it a different name, but it was the same thing. When we got into 1996, yes, we saw some movement into self-government for Tobago and autonomy for the THA. And since then, we've been talking over and over, and of course it comes up just before every election, let us reform and let us give THA more power and this, that, and the other. But we know that after the election, central government is not willing to do that because it serves the needs of central government to have that greater control over the local government system. And that is where we now have to have a forward-thinking and forward-looking local government, central government, who is willing to decentralize, who does not want to hold on to power, who does not want to say that all the funds that we collect, for instance, I mean, a simple thing, we talk about property tax, and we say property tax will, when we get property tax, that will redound to local governments being able to get greater resources to carry out their functions. But again, when we talk about property tax on the one hand and say local government, but then we talk about revenue authority on the other hand, and revenue authority tells us who is going to collect the revenue, but the central government. And the central government is then going to collect the revenue and then determine allocations. Let me use an example to illustrate. In Jamaica, their local government law allows for the central government to collect motor vehicle licenses. But for every parish in Jamaica, the central government is supposed to account for how many vehicle licenses they have collected money for. And that money is transferred to the local authority to maintain roads and whatever else. In that regard, the central government has accepted, well, look, we will collect the money, but we are just the facilitating mechanism to collect, but we will make sure that you get it. You do you think that in Trinidad, any central government is going to want to say, we're going to collect the property taxes, but then we'll simply pass it to you? And if it is a matter of collecting the property taxes and passing it to you, then Point Lisas, the Talparo Corporation, which has Point Lisas and whatever else in it, plus Point Apia and so on, and those municipal corporations outside of the urban areas will collect more property taxes. Will the government guarantee that they will get all the property taxes coming from those industrial estates and so on? Absolutely not. And that's where you need a forward-thinking government, who is willing to consider and deal with issues related to decentralization, the financial autonomy, and the distribution of revenues, to not want to control everything, but rather is willing to share power with others. And that is what we don't have in Trinidad and Tobago. And that's why you need constitutional reform. But again, the political parties will talk about constitutional reform before they get in government. Well, of course, some political parties. This government has refused to even mention the word constitutional reform simply because, as far as they're concerned, they will not be able to get it passed, so just forget it altogether. We noted, for instance, under the UNC, they did in fact try to amend local government to bring in some degree of proportional representation. This government has been talking about local government reform since when 2004, and we haven't yet gotten it. So we wait.
Well, Dr. Ragoonath, I actually appreciate the direction this discussion has gone, because I think you've more or less answered my question in the sense that the strength, the power, and the autonomy of local government is extremely important in the context of the question where there is a separation of powers and where there is greater efficiency and perhaps service in terms of governance. I want to thank you very much for joining me, because honestly, I wasn't expecting it to go in this direction, but this has been very informative and very educational, and I think there is a greater understanding this morning, and I want to thank you for your time and for your presence and for imparting your knowledge.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you very much, sir. Keep well. All the best.
Same to you.